and one that I think is really interesting, both from a like really basic fundamental ecological perspective, and then also one that has a lot of implications for sort of thinking about conservation and management. And I'll talk a little in just a minute about kind of where this question arose from. But it's just, how do we define populations, right? Like, what does that term mean? And how do we put that in the context of conservation management for R2R working groups? And, from a really basic perspective, right, like you all took a population ecology class or an intro class, and you saw the kind of biological hierarchy of organization, and this term population was on it. And, this is sort of the level of organization that we typically work at. Population processes emerge from individual organisms, but it's usually not feasible to sort of study these systems at the level of individual birds. Communities are oftentimes of interest, but usually we're sort of working at the population level. And we have, decades and decades of population ecology, sort of thinking about what makes populations change over time or space. So I pulled this figure out of sharing homes, thinking about seasonal limitation and winter populations limited during the breeding or summer, right? Just to kind of illustrate that we have this very long history of sort of thinking about populations. And despite all of those decades, defining what a population is very difficult to do, right? So there's this kind of typical definition that you'll find in textbooks and that kind of thing, of just a group of individuals of the same species living together in a particular place, which is conceptually useful but very difficult to actually put into practice. There's this Andrew Watson Birch paper, which you probably all had to read at some point in like your classic papers in ecology. They spent a lot of time, an entire chapter of this book, on this idea of like what they call natural populations. And they tried to be a little bit more specific about the ability to interbreed, right? So individuals that are going to interact with each other and have the possibility of breeding, which we can come back and talk about that later. And in order for that to happen, you kind of need dispersal, right? So it's the scale at which dispersal is kind of happening within that unit and not between units. So these are sort of isolated populations in terms of demography, movement, and gene flow. That's a better conceptual definition. It doesn't really make it much easier to sort of think on the ground about what those populations are. There's also this idea, which I think is a little bit more sort of quantitative, that we can sort of think of a population as like a group of individuals where we can kind of average across those individuals to get some idea of what's happening, right? So more of a sort of like mathematical property of like, what's the unit at which we could kind of average over and make some sense of what's happening. So there's been a lot of discussion in the literature about kind of what populations are. But when we actually kind of go on the ground and start trying to define populations, it's kind of a mess, or at least there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think Tom asked me to give this talk to sort of talk about one approach that we came up with. And what I went back to him and said, well, what about just sort of an overview of kind of like the different ways that we define populations, and maybe some sort of advantages or disadvantages. I don't think there's necessarily like a right way to do this. So this is more of a kind of a high level discussion. And, the way we typically define populations is just like where we're working, right? So we have a study plot where maybe we've defined the boundaries of it and we go count the birds in that location. And that's nice, right? It's easy to define. It usually matches the scale at which we're sampling, which is important for kind of drawing inference from those data. We've all done this, right? This is one of my own papers where we were kind of looking at wood thrush population dynamics, and we defined our populations just by like study boundaries. Each of these circles is one of our populations, and you can see that those are totally arbitrary. Some of them are a little postage stamp of forest. Some of them are just study boundaries drawn within a larger patch of forest. but that's the way we kind of define populations in this study. And that has some drawbacks, right? Usually the scale of our study sites is much smaller than the scale that individuals are dispersing. So they're kind of moving in and out of our populations, which goes against the definition from Andrewathan and Birch. Of course, the boundaries are usually arbitrary with regard to other ecological and evolutionary processes that are operating. And I pulled this quote out of the Andrewathan and Birch paper that an arbitrary boundary with local populations interacting across those boundaries is not permissible, right? So if we take them to, kind of be the way we define populations, then we probably shouldn't be doing this. Although, I think it's worth recognizing that for logistical reasons, this is the way we do it. And we've learned a lot using that kind of model. Another way that we often do this at slightly larger scales is by using political boundaries or kind of ecoregions like the BCRs. And again, those have some benefits of usually being pretty easy to define. Those boundaries oftentimes also match management jurisdictions, right? So if you're a state agency that's focused on some tipping point species, you have to work within your state boundaries generally, and so that kind of makes sense to think on that scale. But of course, we kind of end up with the same drawbacks for defining populations based on study areas, which is that these boundaries are, of course, completely arbitrary when it comes to the biology of the species. Maybe BCRs, you could argue, are not totally arbitrary, but they're certainly not based on the ecological or evolutionary processes that are structuring populations from an ecological. So we end up, kind of violating Andrewathan and Birch's rule here as well. This is, so when we started working on wood thrush, I don't know if Brant's in here, he can sort of join us. Oh, Amy can too, she's part of this. We were sort of thinking about what drives wood thrush population dynamics. We had sort of decided we were going to use BBS as an approach to try to answer this question. And we started off thinking, okay, well, we'll define our populations based off of BCRs. And if you look at a map, BBS makes those maps of kind of trends, and Viviana's going to show some similar maps in a second, right? Where populations are increasing and decreasing don't correspond in any way to the boundaries of these BCRs. So if you define your population based off of, the Appalachian Mountains BCR, you've got areas within that are increasing, that are decreasing, they're sort of adjacent to places that are decreasing or increasing. And so what we started to think about was, if we want to understand what's driving declines in some population, and we draw our boundaries in an arbitrary way relative to those dynamics, we might not learn anything, right? If we're sort of modeling change in a BCR where half the BCR is increasing and half the BCR is decreasing, then it might just kind of cancel out and we don't really learn anything. So that sent us down this rabbit hole of, can we define populations using more kind of ecological type criteria? And we came up with this approach. This was published a long time ago now, where what we did is we took BBS data, and at the root level, so each of these dots here is a single BBS root, and we filtered out some roots that don't have enough years of data or don't count many wood thrush, and we were left with these roots where we could say, at the level of the individual BBS root, what is the rate at which wood thrush are declining? And sort of on average, how many birds are counted, right? Is this a very abundant place that's decreasing? Is it sort of a peripheral population that was never very abundant? And then we clustered roots together based off of geographic distance and how distant they were in terms of both the trend and the abundance of those roots. This is sort of that hierarchy here. You can see this kind of tree as the roots get clustered together, and then we use some tools that allow you to sort of define where the cut points are in a tree like this to define population units based off of the kind of shared demographic data. These are the populations that came out for wood thrush. We also then kind of used the typical BBS model to estimate trends and abundance at the level of the entire population. So that's what these graphs are showing. This is abundance. You can see there's some regions with really high abundance. So these are like kind of the core of the wood thrush range. And then quite a bit of variation in trend. Some areas that are increasing, some that are really steeply declining, and some that are kind of in between. So we sort of felt like this is a useful way to kind of operationalize an idea of kind of what is a population unit, at least for the purposes of sort of describing recent or contemporary changes in population size. And then there's some follow-up papers that we published that are sort of linking the year-to-year fluctuations in each of those populations to habitat loss on the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds to try to tease apart seasonal limitation. So that ended up, I think, being a pretty useful framework. We've applied that to a few other species. I don't know if anybody's in here who's asked me, we can like run the code and spit out the population. So we've done it for Canada warblers, golden wing warblers, a few other species that I can't think of. So this is useful. I think there are still some drawbacks here too. I think it's a mistake to sort of think of these as populations in the way that like Andrew Walker and Birch described them. I mean, we don't know how these population boundaries correspond to like dispersal dynamics within the species, so they may not. So I sort of think of these as descriptive rather than mechanistic. And of course, when we're thinking about, okay, well, what do you do with that information in terms of management? A lot of these populations kind of overlap maybe multiple state boundaries or that sort of thing. So turning that into management, these may not be ideal for that. The last thing I was going to talk about, and I wish Kristen Ruig was here or Caitlin Miller was here, because if you have really detailed questions, I'm just going to refer you to this paper because I'm not the genetic person here. But of course, if you've been paying attention over the last 10 years, you know that Kristen Ruig is producing population maps of like every species in North America based off of new genetic and genomic tools. And so there's a lot of different approaches to delineating population units using genetic data or now genomic data, which can also be really useful. This is a map for Canada warblers. Caitlin Miller was a master's student of Kristen's who just defended. So this is using genomic data from Canada warblers and using that to define some what they call adaptive units. So this is actually linking adaptive genetic variation, a sort of clustering based off of adaptive loci within the genome of Canada warblers. And this kind of came out that for Canada warblers, there's kind of this adaptive unit up in the northwest part of the range, an adaptive unit in the east part of the range, and then this kind of small unit down in the southern part of the range. These are trend and abundance estimates. The circles are for each of those units. So we kind of went back and used BBS data to kind of look if those units differ in terms of their trend and abundance, and they do. And in Caitlin's paper, she kind of demonstrates how you can also use the adaptive loci in the genomes to link that variation to environmental conditions. So if I remember right from this, there seems to be the genetic cluster in the east seems to be sort of driven more by precipitation, adaptation to the precipitation of that region, whereas the southern population is a little bit more driven by temperature differences at the southern part of the region. So this, I think, is also really useful. I think there's a reason everybody's sending their blood samples to Kristen right now to do this. It certainly is based off of ecological and evolutionary processes that are driving genetic structure, which is good. And that ability to kind of link genetic structure to environmental conditions is very useful for sort of thinking about things like how is climate change going to impact Canada warblers at the southern part of the range versus this eastern population versus the northwest. When we think about, kind of contrasting this with the wood thrush slide previously, it's not always clear that these kind of historic patterns of gene flow and adaptation are necessarily exactly what we want to know in terms of kind of contemporary or more recent threats. So maybe habitat loss. These units might not be super relevant for sort of thinking about those questions of like, well, how's habitat loss driving current population declines? And I'll just put in a plug for this paper by Caitlin, where she actually goes into a lot more detail about other approaches to defining populations using genetic data and sort of comparing some of those different approaches. So that's useful if you want to know more. So just to kind of quickly wrap up, am I okay time-wise?
You're asking somebody who gets curious and fascinated.
Okay, never mind. So just to kind of wrap up, you know, that was an overview. I don't want to make it sound like I'm sort of pushing one approach over the other. I think like a lot of things, the important thing is to sort of take these different approaches and probably match them to what your objectives are, right? If the demographic approach might be really useful for sort of thinking about current habitat loss might be driving population declines. The genetic approaches might be useful for sort of thinking about how climate change, how species are going to respond to climate change. You might make different decisions if you're sort of thinking about management decision making and that sort of thing. I think there's also like a lot of, we're sort of scratching the surface on this. So this is something Caitlin, I think, kind of started out doing and then, you know, needed to defend. So she didn't quite make it quite as far as she had originally hoped. But, you know, how did genetic data and more recent demographic data sort of collectively tell us about population level processes? I think that's something that hasn't really been explored. And then, of course, since, you know, I came out of the Migratory Bird Center frame of thinking about things, you know, we tend to think about populations from this very breeding-centric perspective. But of course, Canada warblers and all of these other species are spending 6 to 9 months out of the year somewhere else. And I think we haven't even really sort of conceptualized what that means for defining a population. How do you define a population that's moving across the landscape over time and might be mixing with other population units at different points of the year? So all fruitful areas for future research. We're doing questions at the end, right?
Yeah, this is a challenge to this group. I know if we started questions now, we'd be here all day, right? So your challenge is to keep these talks in your head, like, oh man, I'm gonna ask Clark about this to the end and gone through the whole series. That's not easy, right?
Okay. I don't have to introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, you do.
No, okay. Well, it's my honor to introduce Viviana.
Thank you for that great introduction. Yes. I didn't know you knew so much about. So I'm gonna build off of Clark's great introduction, just available information that it's out there, and I'm gonna kind of go through some of the stuff that we've been generating at the population level. And I think Clark's talk really frames that well, because there is always a trade-off in how do we combine individual level heterogeneity and information like tracking data with kind of more population level processes to define these kind of things. So when Clark, for example, was showing kind of those tracks, how do we use that to define populations? We have to think when we, for example, combine it with information on trends, which is population level information, how do we kind of marry those? And I might mention kind of some future work or some current work that we're doing, and it's trying to elevate. You either have to kind of bring information all at the population level so that you can compare it. So for example, if you're looking at population trends, ideally you would take the tracks, translate them to a movement model, and then compare the movement model with the population level. Because ideally, defining a population is hard enough, but it really gets very complex when you're trying to mix inferences at those different levels, at a population level, individual level, etc. So I'm going to go through some of the data products that we have that we're trying to tailor more and more and more to kind of achieve our mission of having a lot of data, that's a global reach, but having local impact, really trying to make it relevant at a local level. And the first, of course, thing that we have, which is kind of our flagship of information, is our status and trends models. So this is weekly relative abundance throughout the entire year, full annual cycle. This is for Canada Warbler. And we now have this information, maybe not for the entire year, because not all species migrate, but we have this for about 2,500 species worldwide. And how we're thinking of moving forward is that we're probably not going to update North America species every year because not seeing any changes every year. But we're going to do is every other year update North American species, and every other year really focus on the kind of worldwide expansion with some of our partners. And what you get out of this, I don't know how many people have seen our new Explorer. So now you can go in, it's kind of like Google Maps, you can zoom in, zoom out, and now you can kind of toggle between abundance, whether you want regular abundance. This is weekly, so you can kind of look to see what weekly relative abundance looks like. You can kind of look at just general abundance summarized by season. So we have breeding, non-breeding, pre-breeding migratory, and post-breeding migratory. And that's usually a mean abundance. But as you'll see later on when I show our downloads page, we're working a lot with max abundance instead of just mean, because it really kind of picks up some of those really key areas, the key habitats and key regions. Under what a lot of folks don't know, and we have this information like very downloadable, nobody uses it. So what's underlying all these models are these really cool habitat associations. But these habitat associations, we have them at the pixel level, but we can also summarize them. So this I'm showing right now, you can't see the title of the thing, but these are habitat associations for Canada Warbler for Maine. And it's not just the associations, but you can actually get directionality. So what you see above in this cake plot, we model about, is there any way to get rid of that? So we have over 120 habitat covariates right now that go into our modeling process. And so this looks at the relative importance of these covariates in kind of a dynamic framework within a specific pixel, or this is for the state of Maine. So as you can see at the very beginning, kind of when they're coming in, there's positive association with nighttime lights. We see that Canada Warbler is indeed attractive to cities during migration. But then during the breeding season, it really is mainly mixed broadleaf needle-leaf forests, and those associations kind of change, those important habitats change later on in the season. And during that exact time, we have, again, negative associations with nighttime lights during the breeding season. And this is all modeled spatially. So you can actually go in and pick every single pixel where we have a prediction is based on this information. You can see how important each habitat type is for every single pixel, for every single week, throughout the whole year. It's really cool information, but at the same time, now we see why nobody downloaded it and used it. You really have to have those questions nailed down. And we also have, that's okay. There we go. Throughout the full annual cycle. So right here are those habitat associations in Ecuador during the non-breeding season. So for every single pixel during migration and also during the non-breeding season, we have the same associations. So they're really heavily associated basically during the entire non-breeding period, evergreen broadleaf forest, and there's negative associations with low density, dense herbaceous, sparse forests, nighttime lights. This is the newest and thing that we've been most excited about, trends. So even in the last panel that I was a part of, and Jeff Geipel was talking about some of the kind of sagebrush species, we have really good trends for those species right now. So if you're thinking either delimiting populations or trying to think of where to focus, we have that combination of trend and abundance. And we're about to submit a paper that compares all this with BBS. We are working with Julian's group on comparing this information, but also integrating. We will be integrating as part of a Fish and Wildlife Service funded project, integrating eBird and BBS trends. So that general information is going to be coming out soon. But here are trends for Canada warblers. We have trends for quite several hundred North American species. And if it doesn't pass our simulations, it's not up on the web. And you don't see it. It's kind of like grayed out. We don't have a prediction for it. You can also toggle and include those that are not significantly different from zero. And during our simulations, we can differentiate bias if we're biasing in directionality or if it's just precision, right? If our kind of credible interval overlaps 0, or if we think we can't pick up that directionality. So if it's up here, we can pick up directionality. But we might just not be that certain about it. So that's what we're allowing folks to see. But one thing that we have that's new that I'm trying to highlight is you can look at different subregions and it will summarize that trend for you. So for New York, the trend is negative 18%. And this is a 10-year trend that we're looking at.
Is that
Huh?
that's a loss over that period?
Yes.
It's not a per year trend.
No, it's a loss for that period. For 2012 to 2020.
Can you download this raw data, please?
Yes. You can download every single pixel in uncertainty right now. Yeah. And the summaries for the trends, I'll show you where else you can. Oops. Something happened there. There's a table missing. Where's Tom? There.
The download though is just for that whole period, right? You can't do your year. Like you can't download just a single year.
No, because trend, you can't have a single year trend, right? You usually have to pick the time period. What we will have by next year are population trajectories. So the trajectories right now that we're using for integrated population models, we will have available. So any species that we have a trend for, you can do an IPM for. So we're right now working on Golden Eagle IPM. That's kind of a more recent one. And we kind of, instead of just having an average, we do have a trajectory. So you can see the year variation, but you're not going to have like, we're not going to make a map for every single year. But that at least we're capturing kind of those influxes and it's not just a straight line. So what's behind this is that average, but not those influxes. I blame you, Tom.
My AI is sensitive, so.
You censored it, okay. So underlying the trend models, which to me is the most interesting part, and that's what we've been focused working on the most, is that we can take the top features that are the drivers of trends. And that's very new. And I think that's what a lot of folks don't know. It's underlying that trend information. So if Tom hadn't censored my table, then you can see that we, out of the 120 different habitat covariates that we have, we can highlight and we can say like which ones are the ones that are contributing the most to the population trends. We can also look at the shape of those effects. So this is, for example, percent evergreen needle leaf forest. We can look at the marginal effect of what's the range that there is kind of like a negative effect, and then you don't really see one. We can have this kind of functional shape for every single habitat. And you can summarize these across the entire range, but because we're making predictions at a 27 by 27 kilometer grid, we have this information for every single pixel throughout its entire range. And the reason we do that is because here we have the trend for Canada Warbler on the left, the spatial effects vary highly. And that's one of the strengths of the spatial temporal modeling that we do. We don't assume the same relationship throughout the entire distributional range, and we know that can't be true. For trends, we have not found a single species that we don't see a lot of variation, not just in the strength, but also for some factors like percent broadleaf needle-leaf forest. In some areas, it's having more of a positive effect. In some areas, it's actually having more of a negative effect. It might have to do with management, for example. And so these are kind of some of the things that looking at these effects spatially allow us to do, and they're not necessarily correlated with abundance. And that has been a really key finding, because a lot of times we think that whatever is going on where the species is most abundant, that has to be driving the trend we're observing. But the unique component, like this is one of using a combination of causal modeling and interpretive machine learning, we're really able to tease apart for the first time habitat effects on trends. And we're actually able to then look at this and say, all right, it's not necessarily just a matter of correlation, because you really have to see what conditions, independent of kind of where the species is most abundant, how things are kind of being increased and decreased.
How are you teasing apart the habitat effects? Is it like a percent change year to year?
I can go into that after, or else we will. Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that. But I'm gonna give you the paper. It's I think it's online already in Methods in Ecology and Evolution. Because it's not it's a little more in depth. So another slide, Tom.
Yeah,
I love you, Tom. It's
At the end of the day, after we're done, and Viviana sets up her table, in a small group where it's not public availability, you can watch the censored slide.
Did you ban her slide?
My guess is the back PC thing.
Yeah, I have a Mac.
Uh-huh.
So what I basically, the take home of the censored or not censored is that we have all of this available for download. This is our download page. You can download all the relative abundance information. You can download all of the trend information. You can download, we have a lot of the R scripts. We have R packages. We have the SMT package that is able to do all the different manipulations. What you can't download are kind of these partial effects, but that's going to be available next year. And I think one of the coolest things that we're doing that I forgot to mention is that we can actually model return on investment. Because we know what those effects are. We can say, well, what if I modify this through management? Where should I be investing in it? If I have the ability to, let's say, increase this by 10%, where am I going to get my best return on investment? So you can really play with a lot of management questions, because spatially there are areas that you're going to get more bang for your buck and other areas that you're not.
Do those spatial patterns there have the same sort of confidence intervals that you showed with the trends?
Yeah, there's confidence intervals around that.
That's the only the one
That come from this. You can't
The
really
white
see it.
ones means there's no significant
Yeah,
positive or negative.
So all the purple ones are all significantly?
yes.
What did I say about questions?
I'm trying my best, Tom.
So this is still Canada Warbler?
Yeah,
Just
this is still Canada. Yes. The other thing that I want to just mention is that we have a website that has a lot of this information at the state level that's summarized. And so we're working on making it easier to Google, but I can share the website information through a QR code later. But what we have is basically you pick your state. We have a couple videos that explain all the information. You pick your state. We summarize data tabularly, so you can look at what the trend is for that species, the critical intervals around it, what the percentage of the population is. We have a lot of different metrics for each individual state, but then we also have another download that has kind of GIS ready files and images that you can import. For example, here's for Canada Warbler for West Virginia. Here it tells you the percent of the model population, and it's during the breeding season. In our tabular data, we also tell you when the maximum peak is for that. And here's the neat thing is this is the breeding season, but this is maximum. And this is why we're using maximum layers for a lot of the conservation applications that we're doing, because it picks up a lot of the importance during migration that you might not pick up, for example, during breeding. So here is kind of the map of maximum relative abundance for West Virginia, and it tells you the week. And it's around like mid-May that you really get the maximum use of Canada Warblers for West Virginia. So all this information we have in tabular form, but also in kind of GIS ready TIFF files. And the last thing that I'll show is kind of the shared stewardship connection maps that we've been working with in collaboration with Partners in Flight, and also with a lot of help from like Deb Hahn, this working group. And what we do is take each state and that has a certain minimum percentage of the breeding population within that state. And then we look at, for example, we do a bit of a weighted average for where all those species are, the highest concentrations of those breeding species are. So for example, this is kind of a representation of 29 breeding species that breed in West Virginia, and where kind of those areas that are most important at the population level. This is not connectivity, this is at the population level. And here is the uniqueness component, which is just, we weigh it by the percentage of the population of that species that's breeding in West Virginia. So for example, if I can't think of it, Alaska is maybe a better example. For shorebirds, a lot of shorebirds breed in Alaska. So instead of having all of the birds that breed in Alaska, the uniqueness map will show you all of the areas that are kind of most important for shorebirds, because Alaska has more of stewardship for a lot of breeding shorebirds. And this is what, we hope will help guide a lot of interest and investments in the full annual cycle. So for example, for West Virginia, you really see a lot of connections with the Andes in Venezuela, some of the highlands in Ecuador, and those are really where some of the highest concentrations of the birds that West Virginia is uniquely poised to conserve during the breeding season. I won't take questions, but I'm happy to answer lots of questions that you should have paid. Thank you.
And we'll see how good a sales job you did, because the purpose of this is to show you the tools are available. Nobody used one of those tools you described after they get on the stock. We'll do a monitoring thing. We'll see how many people need it. Perfect.
All right, well, thank you all. I'm Jill Deppie. I'm Senior Director of the Migratory Bird Initiative. That is at Audubon. I am in our science division, but I work across the organization with conservation staff, policy staff, and our education and outreach staff. Today, what I'm going to talk about is the Migratory Bird Initiative, but expanding a little bit to our science team. The initiative is a little over 5 years old, so it's still new to a lot of folks. I just, I came to this, thinking about what kinds of resources are readily available that you can go online and you can access today. There's a lot more that we're doing that's more customized and very specific to a particular conservation question. But one thing, as I was listening to one of the panels earlier today, it's about the uncertainties, that we lack a lot of information, and things that came up were things like climate change responses, stopover, connectivity. Well, this is one of those situations where we have brought together a lot of disparate types of data, tracking, abundance, distributions, connectivity, and we've consolidated them across many different data sets. And it's a way to make these data available to you. And I will say that the Migratory Bird Initiative did not collect these data. Everything we are working with are data that were generously contributed by scientists or institutions. So we have, for the purpose of, trying to provide information to fill some of those knowledge gaps for the species working groups, just wanted to point out 3 general types of information we have. It's information, sometimes it's visualization, sometimes it's the data themselves. We have migration science and visualizations, we have conservation challenges, and we also have climate science. And I won't talk about this today. Chad Wilsey is here, and he is one of the PIs on our climate science work. So if you see Chad, you can ask him about it. There's a QR code to our climate work. Everything is online through our Survival by Degrees platform. That QR code will take you there. But what we have are changes in species distributional ranges, places where we will lose or gain species under different climate change scenarios. We also have mapped climate strongholds, areas we know will be good for birds now and into the future. So that's, thinking about one of those uncertainties, being climate responses. Audubon has a lot of information on that. We also have climate vulnerability scores for over 600 species, and those are now in the ACAD database, so those climate vulnerability scores. Again, you can go here for all of the information, and those spatial layers are available for download, all of those distributional layers and climate strongholds. Today, I want to focus more on the migration science and conservation challenges. I can't go into detail on all of these because we just don't have enough time. Happy to talk about more of these details, but let me show you just a thumbnail overview, and then I'll show you what they mean for and how they can be used for Canada Warbler, sticking with our flagship species here. So one of the things we have done is we have cataloged a list of all of the tracking data sets that exist. It doesn't mean we have them. And this is an effort. This discovery process was something we led with, we did with Amy and Pete and Autumn Lynn Harrison, Smithsonian in Georgetown with the Migratory Connectivity Project. So we have an understanding of what tracking data are out there. And about a quarter of those existing, or to our knowledge, existing data sets, researchers have contributed. And I know some people in here have contributed tracking data, so let me say thank you personally for contributing those. So what we're seeing here, I'm thinking about data integration. Like, it's not just combining all of the tracking data in one place for species and multiple species, but also pulling it together with connectivity data from banding encounters, from genetics. Viviana set this up perfectly. So the weekly abundance estimates, we've also integrated those as well. So we have several different maps. We have these species migration maps, and this shows the migration of a single species. And I'll show a closer up version for Canada Warbler. We have species connections maps. And then this is a sort of custom-made product lies outside of our Bird Migration Explorer. And this is where we're integrating different types of data to map the migratory pathways. And these are all with Rust. And the code and method is published. And Bill DeLuca is here. If you know Bill DeLuca, talk to him about this. He can share more information. And then the second thing that we've really dug into over the last several years of conservation challenges, it's another one of those things in that word cloud that appeared, threats, impacts of threats. And so we looked at threats in multiple ways. One of the things we spent a lot of time on was what we're calling a species by threat matrix. It has 520 species, and for each species, we list all of the conservation challenges that the species is susceptible to or sensitive to. Comes from a literature review, expert review. It does use the conservation standards threat definitions because that makes it consistent across other things like the shorebird conservation plans use the same threat definitions. We also have our we have conservation footprint maps, and then we have different maps where we actually look at exposure of the species to those conservation challenges. That's sort of, in a nutshell, just different types of products that are available. I'll try to go quickly through for Canada Warbler because I know we're running out of time. We're already behind. So we have the Bird Migration Explorer, which we launched. How many of you have seen it? No, good if not. There's QR codes and I have some postcards with it. This is something we launched in fall of 2022, and we launched it, and you can't see all of these, but we had 9 founding partners who launched this with us. And we have here, you can see, maybe not so well on this screen, but these are almost 10,000 tracks. These are all tracks of birds, and they come from data that were contributed by researchers. And many of you are probably here have contributed data. And I think what's really nice about this is that this is a resource that you can go to at any time of day, and look at it. It is free. There's absolutely no cost. We don't want your email or anything. Just dig in and use it. The other thing is that it is available in Spanish. Because we're thinking full annual cycle, we want to make this available in all languages, and we are looking to expand. And I just one point I want to make back here is just that, you can almost not see the outlines of geographic, the land masses here. When you just look at those tracks, the outlines of North America, Central America, South America emerge. And that's just because we're getting a more comprehensive picture by pulling all of these data together. So this is Canada Warbler. What you see here, you have the distributional ranges in blue and green. They come from an integration, a new data product that integrated eBird status and trends, abundance data, BirdLife range data, BirdLife International, and Audubon. The brown dots here are summarized, are spatially summarized eBird abundance data. So we took the weekly abundance data and we summarized them at different spatial scales, 150 and 50. And as it goes through, you can see how the populations are moving. Again, this is similar to what Viviana showed with the eBird data, those beautiful maps where you see the populations move, but they're summarized spatially. And at some point, you can see some yellow dots that appear up in the northeastern region, the eastern region of Canada Warblers range. So here you can see that there are areas where you have a high abundance of Canada Warbler, and it gives you an idea of where the species is common. It gives you an idea of that shared stewardship for populations where they're abundant in multiple locations. But what you also have by adding on, layering on the tracking data, we have connections between those populations, explicit connections. And that really helps as we've been working with state wildlife agencies. Audubon has several state offices. We're trying to think holistically and hemispherically. So making those connections helps them to establish partnerships with other areas. So, again, this is an advantage of putting all of those data together. Another way to look at connections, we do have, I think it's like 4.1 billion, I don't know, re-encounter data from the bird banding lab, and also genetic data. And if you select any one of these areas that are grayed in, these are areas where we have connections data, you get very clearly areas that you're connected to. So if I'm working here in the sort of upper Midwest, sort of, Ohio in those areas, you can see Midwest, we can see where you might connect with partners across the hemisphere. And one thing I wanted to quickly go back because I was remiss in saying this. Canada Warbler, we're right now working with Kristen Rueg and her students, so we can map on the genetic information we have about the genetics of these populations. So we'll have ranges, summarize abundance data, tracks, and we'll also have that genetic subpopulation data. The other thing I want to just really show, because I think it's something, again, as a common theme in terms of thinking of challenges, we avoid the term threats, and that's intentional, and I'll explain why. But we're looking at conservation challenges, and on the Explorer, at least right now, we're looking at 19 conservation challenges because those are spatial data that we have hemispherically in a format that allows us to look consistently in standardized fashion at species exposure. So Canada Warbler, there are 8 conservation challenges that Canada Warbler is sensitive to. These are not all the conservation challenges, only 19 that we're looking at. We know there are challenges that we can't map. We're going to look at forest management quickly. And what you see here, I'll walk you through this quickly. You see we have these bivariate plots. So you have dots that are large signify a large high abundance in that area. And if it's dark, it means there's a higher percentage of that area. In this case, it's 150 kilometers. A greater percentage of that area is covered by a managed forest. So when you put them together, what this shows you is the species Canada Warbler's co-occurrence with the footprint of, in this case, forest management. So you can see how that exposure shifts across the season, across the hemisphere. And this plot here shows you how exposure varies across the season. I'm going to zoom in here, and Emily's going to follow up and talk more about this. Moving around, Emily. Emily's going to follow this up. But this is what I wanted to point to how we can use these. One thing I want to reiterate is that these maps do not show threat, only exposure, only co-occurrence. So that's really important because if we look at some of these areas, area here, there's a lot of Canada warblers. There's a high exposure to forest management. Here in these large yellow circles, a lot of Canada warblers, but not a lot of exposure to forest management. So with our team, and I don't know, or my colleague here, Margaret Feller is from Audubon, Vermont. She works a lot with forestry. She works with private landowners, thinking about forest management and how we can manage forests to support birds like the Canada Warbler. So when she is looking, and this happens to be more in New York, that, this example here, but if I am looking to figure out where I should engage private landowners or companies that are working, I'm going to go here because this shows me an area of high opportunity. Because if I work with folks here, I can have a big benefit. Of course, if that's if they implement bird-friendly forest management practices. So the reason we call these conservation challenges and not threats, and this is important, and I can't remember, one of the social scientists, mentioned this at some point, Because if we call these threats, okay, we're going to go into this area, we want to work with landowners, and I say, well, look, there's a threat of forest management to birds. I have stopped the conversation. I have now set myself up as somebody who is against forest management. And so we need to think very carefully about our communication. So we intentionally use conservation challenges. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily in a moment because this is only part of the picture. This just tells you the science, gives us an indication of where we go. And it's regional. None of these maps are intended to be used to make decisions on a parcel level, okay? But areas where we should focus. But the next part is we need to understand something about the people that occupy, that live in those areas. Their socioeconomics, their racial identity, their ethnic identity. Emily's going to show us the USGS socioeconomic profiler, which is like the next step. And it's really both of those. They're two pieces of the puzzle. And I just want to tell you that one of the last things we've been working on is a summary where we've taken those conservation challenge profiles and we've put them together into a single plot so we can start looking at exposure to different conservation challenges. This is Canada Warbler, so we're looking at exposure to conservation challenges across the year and different conservation challenges. So we can get a sense of, here we see forest management, exposure is greatest on the grading down. All of these data are already available. We have them for all the R2R species, tipping point, red, orange, yellow lists. And I think it's all together and beyond that, it's like 450. And those are readily available. So QR codes, happy to talk to anybody afterwards. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily so she can talk to you about the next one.
Thanks, Jill. For
Integrating social science, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that setup, Jill. I'm Emily. I'm a social scientist with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And today I'm going to share with you our Fish and Wildlife Service socioeconomic profile tool. So this is a tool to get at information to help you understand the community context in which you work. It's free, it's publicly available, and it produces instant and customizable reports for socioeconomic conditions across the United States, and currently is only available within the United States. So it's continually updated with new information as it becomes available from bureaus like the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this information has a lot of different applications. So to name a few, it can help us predict support for conservation action or opposition. It can help us understand what our audience needs or values. It can help us anticipate challenges to engaging people in conservation, especially underrepresented or hard to reach segments of the population. And it can help us to understand land use change and drivers of economic change. So Canada Warbler, in keeping with our species here, it's an on-alert species. I don't need to tell all of you what that means. And they rely on this mixed conifer and deciduous forest with a shrubby understory. So I'm sorry, Jill, I used the word threat. Sorry. They are challenged by forest management in their breeding range, which you can see in the orange up on this map, and light pollution along their migration corridor in yellow. So let's say hypothetically, I work for a conservation organization, Wild for Warblers, and we're all about reducing the decline of songbirds. So I've come into some grant money and I need to decide where to use my limited resources to have the most impact. So looking at this Audubon Explorer tool that Jill shared with us, we can see that the Canada Warbler has high abundance and high exposure to the conservation challenge of forest management in this part of its range. So east of Lake Ontario in the Adirondack Mountains near Syracuse, New York. So when I look at my tool here, this is the socioeconomic profile tool. I've zoomed to Syracuse. This seems like a good opportunity, a good place for me to maybe engage the community in this work. So first, you select your political boundaries for analysis. And you can get data at the census tract level all the way to the state level. So choose here what scale you'd like to see your analysis done. And next you select your area. So right now I've selected 4 counties where this work could potentially occur. So you can either click on the map to select cities, counties, census tracts. You can draw a polygon around your area of interest, or you could choose a point within a specified distance. So after I've selected my area, we can see a few socioeconomic indicators here on the left side. This is really just a snapshot. There's so much more in the report, and I'll get into that later, but highly recommend downloading the full report. So some of the indicators we have here are median household income, the percentage of population that identifies as a minority, the percentage of the population that speaks English less than very well, families below the poverty level, and the median age. So just some initial reactions to this. This is the median household income. So I can see that Jefferson County at the top has the lowest median income, but all of my counties are below the comparison location for the United States here. Similarly, for families below the poverty level, 3 out of my 4 counties have at least 8 or 9% of their population living below the poverty line. So with these data, maybe I'm thinking, well, to engage these folks in conservation, maybe they have other things that we need to do for them before they can properly engage. So maybe if we're having a public meeting, we need to provide transportation to get them there. Maybe we offer food, or maybe we provide childcare. Similarly, we see Jefferson County has a higher proportion of minorities than the other counties in my report here, almost 19%. So perhaps in Jefferson County, more bilingual or multilingual approaches would be needed, or perhaps you'd want to have someone from your organization that more represents the community you're working in, be a liaison and interacting with that community. And then lastly, median age is the last socioeconomic indicator on this initial view. Jefferson County at the top has a median age of 33, compared to Hamilton County at the bottom here, median age of 56. So maybe we focus our efforts on more youth programming in Jefferson County. Just some initial takeaways I got just from looking at this briefly. So I mentioned there's a full report, so there's a button to download the full report, and you get all of these different things in here for your individual units of analysis as well as your combined units, so combined counties perhaps in my case. And there's a wealth of information in here, and on the left side you get your tables and figures, and on the right side you have interpretation of the data. So it tells you why it's important, where it comes from, the metrics on validity and things like that. So there's plenty in here that I didn't go into, things like, why is the population changing? What is the unemployment rate? What are the main industries in your area of concern? Who owns the land and things like that. So just to show you in this example of the Canada Warbler in upstate New York, we can see our land ownership for all 4 of our counties as well as combined. And it's pretty exclusively private landowners here. So just a little bit of other federal land within Jefferson County. So to me, I would say, okay, this is a great opportunity to partner with an organization that already works with private landowners and already has those relationships established. And in addition to partnerships, this can also help you determine or give you insight into how land use might change in the future. So that was really brief, but I highly recommend using the desktop, but if you wanted to save the URL on your phone, there's a QR code for you.
Thanks, Emily. That's so helpful to have to see those insights from. Really great. Thanks. And now for something completely different.
Yeah, right. The Monty Python transition. So I'm Jim Soraka. I work for a group called the Institute for Bird Populations, and I'll try and keep us on track or get us back on track here. Be brief, but I just wanted to talk about a couple of initiatives, efforts that we coordinate At the Institute for Bird Populations, our niche is focused on demographic rates, vital rate estimations, so that's kind of our niche coming in here. We're not talking about a lot of the tipping point species so much, but these programs were developed under sort of the old partners in flight idea of common birds common and widely distributed declining species. Anyway, so these are maps of two efforts. As I said, we coordinate the maps or monitoring avian productivity and survivorship program. The orange, these are bird banding stations operated during the North American breeding season. Over 1,300 records or 1,300 stations, a couple million records of hundreds of species. And more recently developed in the blue in the non-breeding season, those Mosby program stations. These are basically operated between November and March each year, monthly pulses of bird banding during the non-breeding season. I say over 100,000 records, something like that. It's hard because some people are and some people aren't banding Brittany tribal resident species as well. So these are kind of like our shared species. That's the kind of data set we're talking about. Both of these efforts, the guy up here in the top right, David Santi, are his real inspiration. His efforts all for decades is what made these programs what it is, what they are. But still, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of collaborators, volunteer people, federal biologists, academics, all sorts of people contributing data to these programs. So, sort of the goal of, for those who may not be familiar with the data sets, is just to make you aware of what's available, and hopefully people will take more advantage of using these data. So when Dave came up with the idea to start these things, the idea was to complement things like the breeding bird survey. eBird wasn't around, of course, at the time when maps were started, but that fits into this too. That having vital rate information to plug into models that can also incorporate abundance data. In addition, we also have in addition to the vital rates, population level information, you get all kinds of data on individuals, like body condition as well. Just incorporating into integrated population models is a big goal and a big focus of recent work. And from those models, assess contributions of these vital rates to population change. And finally, it was mentioned Kristen Narug and all their work in Genoscape stuff. We've been contributing feathers and blood samples to those efforts for, again, decades now as well. So a lot of those data have gone into producing maps like this for the Wilson's Warbler here. We've worked with a bunch of other species as well. But in addition to that, it's also, I hope that people will think about these programs as platforms to get other kinds of hardware and other sorts of methods for isotopes or geolocators, things to also better understand connectivity across broad spatial scales between non-breeding and breeding areas. And so this was an initial product developed when Dave was still around, maybe almost 10 years ago now, but it is the most comprehensive list of species for which you can go and you can download. You can look at maps at the BCR scale of different vital rates, recruitment, productivity, survival, population growth rate, capture rates of adult and young birds. So you can look at those for 150 plus species. Some of them are very limited in spatial scale for which data is available, or the number of PCRs for which data are available. But it's been used for a variety of interesting uses. Since it's come out. So there's that. More recently, we developed this maps data exploration tool, and this is sort of the version 1.0. And actually, I was just playing with it the other day before coming in here. So some of the process results, some of them something's gone a little haywire, so we'll have to, but most of it works, but, it is in either case, in the process of being updated, we're updating the analyses, we're gonna have another couple of years of data, so it'll be up through at least 2022 here in the next few months, so that'll be back online, and this, actually, it's, I can get you the information, but it's cut off here, and I guess I don't know how to do the QR code thing. Anyways, let me know, and I can, it's easy enough to Google and find anyways. But in addition to process results like this, you know, where you can look at BCR scale results, you can click on them and get figures of year-specific estimates and things like that too. You can also download the data and CSV file. And importantly as well, you know, it used to be a little bit cumbersome, like working through us to try and get maps data and figure out what kind of data you wanted and, you know, what regions and what years. And now you can do that all on your own. You can just go there and you can get, as I said, this is through 2018, it will soon be through 2020. You can download whatever maps data you want and use it for whatever. And that includes all the, you know, individual information with molt and fat and, you know, wing lengths. And any of those, you know, basically all the data, anybody's banders, all the banded data you collected is in there. So hopefully people will take advantage of that. Yeah, so anyways, as I said, it's version 1.0, and these new things will be incorporated into this in the future. And that'll be another thing is individual maps or MOSI contributors, you'd be able to as well have tools to like estimate survival for those species that you can, some level for some group of stations that you have and things like that. So those things will be in the next round incorporated as well. And so this is just this is a couple of, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago, collaboration with Scott Wilson at Environment Canada, following up on the Canada Warbler example. This is before we had the new genoscape map of Canada Warbler, but you know, roughly looks like what, you know, except for the southern distinction, what we had in Clark's figure there. But you have an eastern population. We have the central population and then the Western Canada segment of the population. And these were delineated in part by geolocator data from Colombia, from Ana Maria Gonzalez and McBailey, suggesting that birds that they tagged in Colombia separated in this way in the breeding season. Some other species, I don't know if I have the modern terminology for what the lists are for R2R, but the list I have it called the moderate urgency species. But these are kind of like the level with maps that we're dealing with, widely distributed flying species. And so these are some of the take-homes from Scott's paper. These 3 regions, basically in the central region, in this top panel here, we have increasing populations in the west, and especially the east declining populations. And that pretty much maps the same picture that the PBS data point to. These are just based on maps captures, at the maps adult captures at the station. We'll see here in the central region where we have increases in the population, we have higher survival compared to the western and eastern populations. Trends in survival may be tending to increase in central region as well. Recruitment tending to be low across the regions. We didn't find any real difference between productivity or trends in productivity. So it seems like differences in trends seem to be a survival recruitment sort of thing for Canada Warbler. And so from that, he also looked at changes in anthropogenic footprint. So it incorporates a whole bunch of metrics. Forest loss, population density, basically any kind of human disturbance on the landscape. Across the breeding range, you had 14% increase in footprint. A lot of that happened in the western region. And this is an area where we have a whole bunch of map stations around the oil sands, industrial development around the oil sands region. These dots are shaded by percentage of disturbance from oil industry footprint stuff. But anyways, Scott's paper, then showed this increase and showed this relationship between breeding densities and what we call residency probability. So the probability of a bird at a site being a breeding resident at the site. Both of those things seem negatively related to footprint. So in addition to the survival signal, at least in the West, it seems there's this also signal on the breeding grounds, probably related to recruitment, fewer birds recruiting into the area, and then the birds that are there being less likely to be breeders. And we've since, going back to sort of the multi-species focus of the original development of the program, Canada Warbler also in that analysis, this is from a more recent paper, showed that same signal, the lower abundance and lower residency in places that were more highly disturbed. And that was, as I said, a signal that was apparent throughout the bird community, but especially the Canada Warbler was one that showed the strongest response. And as far as footprint and the survival part, the eastern region, which presumably, at least based on the information that we had at the time, is mostly wintering in the eastern part of the Andes. That part of the Andes is also experiencing the highest increase in footprint. So, so both of those things, increasing footprint in parts of the breeding range and parts of the wintering range is probably contributing to Canada Warbler declines. That is, if they're still declining. And that's it. So that's just an example of using Canada Warbler, the kind of things that we can hope to get out of using these kinds of data, and hopefully more people will take advantage of that if they can. Randy.
Somehow I have to make the time for.
5 to 8 minutes, right?
Right.
So I'm looking for a job as a facilitator. I'm really genuinely talking. I'm gonna turn it over to you, Randy. I know you have another workshop coming up.
Yeah.
Do your best, and I'm sorry, apologize for the lack of opportunity. I think we have a session at the very end of the day where we might be able to talk with the presenters, but take it away.
Okay, I'll do my best to go quickly.
Well, what you have to say is really important. You're the transition to action.
Right, the transition to action. So I am going to talk about this port tool in the context of setting population goals, and maybe in reflection on some of the previous talks, maybe this should really be the management unit objective tool, the MORT instead of the FORT. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how setting population objectives supports species conservation, tell you what the port tool is, and then show you a quick example from Canada Warbler. I thought there was some really good conversation this morning during some of the panel discussions about kind of the place of goals and objectives in our conservation recovery strategies. So, setting numerical population goals help us define what that desired outcome is in very measurable and easily communicated terms. And at range-wide and regional scales, the goals really help us in both kind of strategic and prioritized action. So as Tom said, it kind of helps us think about, and using some of these tools that were just explained, really focusing in on where should we focus our actions and foster those collaborations that are critically important to carrying out those actions. And then these sorts of goals also help us communicate the conservation need that we're trying to accomplish. What do these birds need? Where are we trying to go in terms of recovery? And also helping to communicate what the contributions of those various partners are going to be. And when we talk about the need to fund the things that we're doing, having those numeric, very discrete goals and objectives can help us articulate our outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And that is, attractive to many funders. So what is this population regional populations, regional tools. I can't even say it now. You can read it. But what it is it's a Shiny app for exploring and visualizing population trajectories and setting goals at both range-wide and regional scales. And I have to acknowledge that this was really took off when Jim Herkert and Roz Renfrew were working on their bobolink conservation plan, and they developed sort of the prototype for this tool. And then no other than the black skimmer thought that this was an excellent thing that we could turn into something that would be more applicable widely across. And so between Tom's efforts, he roped me into doing this in a way that we could sort of pre-populate examples using all of the partners in flight watch list species at that point in time. So this tool is about 5 years old now. So take that into consideration. And then Caitlin Gillespie at Klamath Bird Observatory really did the sort of behind the scenes work in terms of creating this Shiny app. And it provides 3 different scenarios to look at. So you can see the past 10-year trends based on breeding bird survey and sort of projecting those into the future. So if there was no additional conservation action, kind of what would we predict in terms of those trends continuing to the future? And then we have the example of what the sort of suggested trend goals are from the Partners in Flight 2016 plan. And then it has the option where a user can define their own trend goals that they would like to see. They could keep the recommended trends from the Partners in Flight plan, or if those don't seem appropriate, they can enter their own goals. And so again, this can really be a catalyst for conservation and coordination. Really helps to facilitate those discussions across partners in different parts of a species range at sort of regional scales, and helping them think about how they're collectively going to achieve what they want to be as a range-wide goal for a particular species. And this is just a schematic of the trend goals that we had in the 2016 Partners in Flight plan. And it's based a little bit on the level of urgency or concern for different groups of species. So the red watch list species are the ones that are most in trouble. And we kind of suggested we really need to do a lot of immediate action and try and increase those types of species right away. If there are species that, like some of the ones that Jim just showed, they've been in sort of long-term decline, but they're still relatively abundant. Let's try and see if we can first kind of slow the population decline and then maybe gradually try and improve the status of those sorts of species. And then we have this group of species that are maybe not necessarily declining, but still vulnerable because of things like small population size that we want to just continue making sure that they don't decline. And so those are the types of population trend goals that are input into the port tool. I hope this will work, but this is a little demonstration of what the tool actually looks like. You can select from any of the watch list species, the drop-down menu. I'm going to select Canada Warbler since we've been talking about Canada Warbler. You click load the page and it provides this table where things are broken down by province and BCR stagons, that polygon of cross-section between BCRs and either states or provinces. It gives you the estimated population size based on the Partners in Flight estimates. It shows the past 10-year trend. And then this is where the goals, you can both look at a 10-year goal and a 30-year goal. The starting values are those population objective trends from the PIF plan. But as you can see, you can click on any of those and enter your own goal that you would like to set for those state by BCR polygons. And then we have a variety of different display options here. So plot options, you can either look at state or province or BCR. So I'm going to click on BCR. You can select any of the BCRs within the species breeding range. I'm going to select BCR 14, which is the Atlantic Northern Forest. So pretty much New England and up into the Atlantic Canada states. It will show you the overall population trajectory. And then for each of those state or BCR polygons within BCR 14, you get that trajectory at that level also. So you can see both in terms of estimated population size in those geographies, and then what this kind of looks like into the future based on, again, the user-defined trajectories if you want to change them from what the partners in flight trends are. So these are kind of projecting what the partners in flight goals would look like over time for these different state by BCR province trajectories. It also gives you just sort of a bar chart, so you can, another way to visualize what the different rates of change for the populations within those state by BCR polygons look like from that point of view. And then there's also some summary tables, so you can sort of compare just numerically trends based on the user input or the PIF population goals or the trajectories if the current 10-year trends were to continue at a range-wide level. Okay, I think you probably get the idea there, and we're pretty close to being done here. I don't think there was, yeah, that's enough. No. Let's let this run all the way through.
I need to tell you that once you go to this place, you can never get out.
Apparently. Escape. Yes, thank you. I'll try that. There we go.
My classes. Sit down, like, okay, fine.
Doesn't really work. But anyway, yeah, I think that's enough. So again, this is one sort of, I think, generation of what this tool could be. Again, it was based on Greenberg survey data at those particular, state by BCR sorts of geographies. With current data, say from eBird or some of these other data sources, we could really think about a new and improved sort of tool like this. If people see a value in having something like this for really thinking about how to assign objectives in different parts of a species range based on, again, if it's more management unit by state or by BCR or whatever, great. If we want to do something more along either natural populations or something that we get out of eBird, sky's the limit, I think. So we'd be really interested in having some conversations about what the next generation of this kind of tool would look like. And I will stop there.